I have put a body in the fridge. No, I have not. There's two kinds of people in the world: the people who put bodies in fridges and the people who find bodies in fridges. My name is Chris Vander Kaay, located in Central Florida. I am a filmmaker. I'm a found footage fan and curator slash critic. I'm an author of several books, a couple of fiction and several nonfiction. I was a late adopter because I was raised in a family with conservative Christian parents, so that was off limits. In fact, pretty much anything above PG was off limits. You know, occasional PG-13 would sneak in there, but mostly it was PG and under. The first horror movies I saw probably would have been around 15, 16, 17 when I was over at a friend's house. However, I knew I was drawn to horror because the things that I liked were stuff that was weird, bordered on dark. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factories and your Watcher in the Woods and your Return to Oz. Like, those were the movies I was drawn to because they were the closest thing to the experience I was seeking that I was allowed to see. Even the animated Alice in Wonderland, which is like surrealism bordering on like darkness. And so I was really drawn to that. I had been creating this very long list of found footage films because I love the idea of found footage filmmaking, or I call it in-world camera filmmaking. So that includes fake documentaries, false reality TV, stuff like that. So I love all of it. I love the idea of that secondary layer of artifice that goes over the top of a story and how it changes the way that we see the story. Anytime somebody asks, what's a good found footage movie? And I'll be like, oh, here, let me share this list with you. And then they look at it and it's like 1,800 movies long. And they're like, oh, there's no way in hell I'm going to dig through this, man. Come on. So I started going through those lists and started dividing them into more palatable categories. Because often what will happen is they'll be like, hey, I really loved Grave Encounters. What else is there that's found footage like that? Well, there's a lot of stuff that's not. It's found footage, but it's nothing like Grave Encounters. Well, if I can divide them up, and you got one category that's your paranormal investigations, and another one that's your cannibal movies, and another one that's deadly competitions, or stories that take place in the forest, whatever they may be. Once I realized that that's a more fun and interesting way to subdivide found footage, and a way to also start to take it seriously, to treat it in the same way that other genres get treated. There's so many subgenres of horror we all talk about. We should be doing the same thing with found footage because they have some very distinct ones. And so I started creating all those lists. And so I was unaware that I was creating all this research for what would eventually become found footage finds. Right now it's 5 episodes where each one of them focuses on a specific subgenre of found footage. And within the episode, we do recommendations, we do filmmaker interviews, we do sort of open with a sort of a deep dive about this particular subgenre, why it's used so much in found footage, why it's so effective, things like that. I think we end with a recommendation to go over to Letterboxd to check out the list of all the movies that fall into that category. There's not a ton of serious scholarship or history being done for found footage, which is always surprising to me because it's the newest genre of film. The fake documentary is the newest one born. And also it's the most groundbreaking in terms of it's the quickest to pick up on technologies. New technology, there is potentially a way that it affects the way that you tell stories. Screen life storytelling, or using a 360 camera, or being able to shoot something entirely in a single take or from a dash cam or things like that. So all of these are innovations that come out of the technology and then are immediately adopted into found footage or fake doc storytelling. I wanted to take it seriously, and so I thought, well, I can do that by making these episodes of the show. So I do have a Screen Life episode, I have a Bigfoot episode, Into the Woods, zombies, and then newscasts and reality TV are the 5 categories for the episodes that I've done. Yeah, just a deep dive, a lot of love for the genre, some guest voices, and then some filmmakers who have worked in the genre just talking about the film and their experience making it. Each episode is kind of reflective of the subgenre it falls into. So for Screen Life, I actually recorded it like a Screen Life movie. And for the reality TV and newscasts, I shot myself in front of green screen and then punched myself in as like a newscast and stuff. Those were a lot of fun to create because the idea for me was like, how can I not just talk about them, but how can I sort of be a part of them in some capacity? There's a movie called The Proposal. The premise of the film is a guy sets up and hides a camera because he's going to be proposing to his girlfriend tonight. He sets the camera up, and then in the midst of the evening, before he gets to be able to pop the question while the camera is still recording, there is a home invasion. And everything that you see is from this single, continually recording camera that's hidden in the corner of the room because he wanted to get the surprise of asking his girlfriend to marry him on camera. It's a very ambitious movie, and I really respect when people who don't have a lot of resources still swing for the fences. Another one that I really enjoyed this this not necessarily for innovation's sake, but I just thought it was an effective movie, is called The Coldness. It's about a guy who's looking into some deaths/disappearances. I believe it's actually, he's a retired police officer, a retired detective, and he found, like, one of his cases, he found a body inside of a refrigerator. They put themselves there, and they had like closed themselves inside the refrigerator. So it wasn't like this happened to someone. Someone did this to themselves, and he was like haunted by it and decided to look into what could have possibly transpired to cause this. The lead guy is fantastic. He just feels very lived in as an actor, like very believable. I hadn't really seen this angle for an investigative documentary before. For what is a very low budget, I thought it was very effective and very clever. I know there's the cliche, fridging the girlfriend. The whole thing about like the tragedy that fuels the hero is that a woman in his life was something horrible was done to her. One of the things I kind of liked about The Coldness was one of the characters that we meet is actually a woman, and she did this to herself as opposed to having it done to her. And so I thought, that's an interesting reversal on the expected trope. So that was kind of one of the first things that got me interested in it, and where it goes is pretty wild. I have put a body in the fridge. No, there's two kinds of people in the world. The people who put bodies in fridges and the people who find bodies in fridges. Don't cut this part out. Discussion is not endorsement. It was an experience in my life, and not because I want anyone to go out and watch it. So many years ago, I want to say it's 2010, 2012, somewhere in that ballpark, a guy that I know asked me to write a Western. And I wrote a Western, which I really liked. It was kind of a spiritual sequel to the Oxbow incident, and it was kind of like the flip side of Unforgiven. What if the character of Bill Money from Unforgiven, what if it went a different direction? What if he did learn to try and like get his shit together, and he tried to go right, bad things happen, and instead of murdering everyone, he sort of tries to get his life together. So that's the script that I wrote. It was optioned. They started to turn it into a movie. It's $1 million Western, which is very exciting. And then the rewrite process happened, but I was not much involved in the rewrite process. I still have screenwriting credit on the film, but it became very much soft redemption, faith-based Christian film, which I always knew there was going to be a faith aspect of it, which I was fine because I happen to be a believer of certain things. I guess you call it spiritual in nature. So I wasn't opposed to that, but the way that it was orchestrated and executed, I was not happy with at all. And then to add insult to injury, not that I have anything against Hallmark, but it ended up as a Hallmark original, but it came out from it was acquired by a company called Echo Light Studios. If anybody looks that up, what you will discover is that failed Republican presidential nominee Rick Santorum was the guy that ran Echo Light Studios. The first film that I ever made, and then it got rewritten so it does not sound like my movie, was then picked up by a guy whose opinions and beliefs could not be further from my own. And then he put it out at a place that I would not necessarily have hoped that my Western would have ended up, which is the Hallmark Channel. So it's been this weird sort of like balloon/albatross in that you get to say, the first script I ever wrote, it was $1 million Western that premiered on the Hallmark Movie Channel. That's awesome. If anyone asks any follow-up questions, that's where it becomes the albatross. So I started on the high end. I got paid terribly, but the movie was fairly expensive. And then I sort of went into the desert and not being able to get any other work, because what I wanted to make was horror films and thrillers, and all I had as credit was a Hallmark Western. It was a complicated few years, which is what brought me to making Ask on my own. My first feature film as a director. I've written other ones, but it's the first one that I wrote and directed and starred in and produced. The short pitch of Ask is that it's basically the monkey's paw for the YouTube generation. It's about a trying and failing YouTube influencer who gives some strange advice from a mysterious life coach, and things start going really well for him, like alarmingly well, like suspiciously well in his life. But then, of course, as it always goes with the monkey's paw, be careful what you wish for, because things go poorly for him after that. I made it for $250, basically reverse engineered from some real things that were happening in my life to back into a story. Did together, made it for, like I said, less than $250, and it came out in October of 2024. It's like the little movie that could. I'm constantly surprised at how many people have reached out to me to tell me how much they enjoyed it. It has shown in theaters twice now, in Houston and in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Some known independent film actors and producers saw the film and actually reached out to me and told me that they enjoyed it. And I actually got the opportunity to read for an independent film that I would never have gotten the opportunity had they not happened to see this movie. So it really is a movie that's sort of punching above its weight in terms of what I put into it versus what I'm getting back out of it. It's really been a great experience. What I have found is most frightening to me is the fear that comes from large groups of stupid people. The speed with which dumb humanity can ruin things for the rest of not dumb humanity is terrifying to me. We've watched it happen in real time over the last few years, how quickly what we thought was concrete, but was actually just a gentleman's agreement among people that we were all going to be civil and we were all going to agree to such and such, that we realized that there really aren't guardrails about society a lot of the time. And sometimes someone can just decide they don't give a shit and just do what they're going to do. And if there's a small enough group that agrees with them and that can and get themselves into a position of wielding any kind of power or influence or strength or whatever, things turn so quickly. I used to think that George Romero was a pessimist, and what I realized is that he was a prophet. All of his stories were about how there is a monster outside, but it's the guy next to you that will kill you. I used to think, well, that's kind of a bummer. And now I think, damn it, George, why didn't you prepare us better? Why didn't you give us some, you were right, but you could have given us some battle plans. So I think that's the thing that scares me the most. I'm not scared of monsters. I'm a little disturbed by cannibalism, but by and large, people who are both dumb and certain at the same time, those are the things that scare me. One of the things that I think inherent in the series of the Living Dead franchise is that humanity is sort of doomed. And in a way, we thought that the zombies were the bad guys all along. But in Day of the Dead and even some in Land of the Dead, what we see is that the evolution of the zombie itself is to, in some ways, become a more honest version of humanity. Bub, Big Daddy in Land of the Dead, they start to evolve, and they maybe start to evolve into a different and potentially better version of humanity than the humanity that it came from. And so there is some sense of hope that, yes, while sometimes things have to burn down, they have to burn down in order to be rebuilt. And so sometimes the struggle that we have to go through isn't a thing we need to avoid. It's a thing we need to get through. You know, we got to like grit our teeth and get to the other side of it. And then Mike Flanagan, which I think it's very interesting how connected I feel to most of Mike Flanagan's work, in particular Midnight Mass, which is maybe one of my favorite pieces of media ever, because he and I have, I think, very different beliefs. I believe he's atheist or at least agnostic, whereas I'm a believer, but we both seem to have very deep interest in discussions of spirituality and the way that people weaponize it for negative reasons, and also a deeply humanist thread that is very important to him, and an interest in wanting people to think about the idea of death. Not in a morbid way, not in like an obsessive way. Of course you need to think about that. The idea that there's a finish line and when you hit it, there's no more chances, means everything you do counts. So much of his work is meaningful to me in that sense. You get one go at this, guys. Is this really what you're going to do with your time? Both of them, I think, are very powerful in very different ways. And also both were big fans of Stephen King. I do think it's not surprising to me that both of them were friends of Stephen King's and adapters of his work, because they do all have seem to have a similar ethos, which is like a faith in individual humans and a lack of faith in society. Very rarely is a movie that is supernatural in religion usually purporting to be exactly what it is on its face, right? It's either one of two things. It's symbolically about something that's going on in the real world, and this is an interesting way to portray it, or it's talking about the real world extrapolation of the way people behave because of religious beliefs it's discussing. It's very rare that I watch a religious horror movie and go, that's a very good observation about demons. Like, it's never really about demons. It's about the Catholic Church, or it's about what do demons represent? Do they represent addiction, or do they whatever? But also, I like the idea that religious stories, by and large, pump the prime of thinking about mortality, which is an important conversation that most people nowadays don't have. There's very little time in the world to get bored or to look inward or to think about something because you don't have something else to do. One of the great things about horror, and particularly religious horror, is it requires, on a story level, essentially, for you to engage with the idea of a point at which you or your soul or whatever stops existing, at least in this shape, and what happens to it, and what does that mean about the morality of the way that you behaved and the way that you treated others. And that's not really a thing that you engage in most other genres without it feeling preachy. It doesn't feel preachy in a horror film, even though sometimes it can be very preachy. If you watch The Exorcist, there's like more Bible verses quoted in that than there are in most Christian films. But it doesn't feel that way because it's also looking at darkness. There's something very appealing about that to me, about the idea that you can have your cake and eat it too, and also kill it. Similar to zombies, there's so many interesting ways to reinvent this central premise. There's like a movie called Ava's Possessions, which is entirely about a woman who was possessed and is in recovery from possession. So she's going to group therapy and basically it's essentially a movie about addiction and about what happens once you had a bender and you ruined your life and you have to make apologies to all your family, except what if instead of that, it was a demon and you might accidentally relapse and get the demon back. And then there's a movie called Luz, L-U-Z. The movie is about a lady that's in a car accident and the driver is possessed by a demon who was obsessed with her when it was inside the body of someone else and then possessed this person. But the whole movie is done almost like a reenactment. Like after the accident, they're in this empty police station and they're sort of reenacting what transpired in the vehicle. And so you're cutting back and forth between the real moment and the reenactment that they're doing. It's fascinating. It's like if somebody put on a supernatural version of Taxi Driver as like community theater. It's super, super cool and really beautifully shot. The horror community means a lot to me, particularly the found footage horror community, because this is what they do. They're very loyal to the genre that they love. They will hunt down the most obscure fucking, pardon my French, the most obscure fucking movie that was only ever available on bootleg Laserdisc in 1997 in Japan of a movie by Koji Shiraishi, right, that has never been released anywhere else. And they'll find it because it's the holy grail of found footage that no one's ever been able to get their hands on. So I love that attitude of like, there's more to be found and I'm going to go find it. That is how people found my movie. I didn't advertise, I didn't market it. I put it out. And I sort of posted in some groups and on Reddit and stuff like that. And all of the following that I've gotten and all the feedback has been from people who hunted it down and loyally found it. So the horror community means a lot to me in that respect. As a person who is a critic and a fan as well, I sometimes get frustrated about the jockeying for position that I find within the community when I'm a member of it. There is gatekeeping that happens a lot. Not only gatekeeping of different kinds of communities. Oh, you must be this tall to ride this ride kind of thing. Oh, you haven't seen such and such, like shaming people for what they haven't experienced. I've watched a lot of movies and I still haven't seen like a fraction of the shit that's out there. So the idea of shaming someone as opposed to being excited that they get to experience a thing for the first time, I wish there was more of that energy. We're supposed to be the rejects that couldn't fit anywhere else. That's why we're here. So can we try harder to not model mini versions of that shit from elsewhere in here as well? I would argue that that's mostly what it does. By and large, I think that horror movies are healthy, especially in continually modern civilized times. Horror movies are one of the few places, like Grimm's fairy tales or other places, where you're allowed to talk about truly terrible things so that people can have the thought experiment of what happens when people do bad things without having to experience the bad things. I used to say all the time, the reason that cannibal movies are important is because if there's no cannibal movies, there's no one to talk about why cannibalism is bad. And I feel similarly about the idea that I remember somebody saying, well, I'm so tired of there being sex scenes in movies. Like that belongs in porn. And I was like, do you really want every portrayal of sexuality to only be in pornography? What about troubling versions of sexuality? People who deal with trauma, you really want that to be the purview of pornography? Or would you like to be able to have that inside of art where you can explore it and learn from it? And that's kind of how I feel about horror. Horror is one of the best places to learn about things that worry us in ways that are safe to learn about them without feeling like we actually have to worry. Face death, face the loss of a loved one, face injury or dealing with disability. Like all of those things come naturally out of the stories that are told in horror, and yet can ultimately be very hopeful things because a lot of them are about survival. Not just like conquering the bad guy, but living and thriving and moving on in life. It allows for permission to have conversations you don't get to have anywhere else. So I definitely think it's helpful. The thing that I hope for the future is that we don't lose the opportunity for people to make a living being able to tell stories in a filmic medium. There are arts that have kind of gone in that direction. Arts that have become hobbies by virtue of the fact that people can't really get paid to do it anymore. I don't know anyone who is a poet for a living. If they're a poet, they're also a professor, or they're also whatever else they are, right? We have chased the arts out of the community of a profession. And I do worry, in the same way that there is, Broadway in the West End, there will be stage plays, but by and large, the rest of the country goes to see community theater where nobody gets paid because they're doing it for love. I do worry that that's where film is going to end up, where people are going to only be doing it for love and not make any money, except for a small elite group of people who can afford to do things big enough that they can find a way to make the money back. So my hope for the future would be that we find a way to stem the tide of that, because I don't ever think it's a good thing when a child who has a potential interest in an art and would be very good at that art, looks around and doesn't see any potential for that to be a thing that they could do something with in the future and therefore don't pursue it. I think art is as important as anything that someone learns for the development of their brain, for the ability for them to understand and to empathize, to communicate and to discern. And the more that we turn those things into something that is optional, unpaid, and hobby based, the more we hobble the next generation of people that will not be able to experience it the way that we did when we were younger. So my hope is that we find a way to bring that back into the fold in a way that isn't just everybody being able to create their own AI-based version of a superhero story in their living room by themselves. I hope that there is still a communal aspect of storytelling and stories that people tell, that they're not just creating to kill time and please the fandom, but to actually challenge people. That is my hope. My hope is that we find a way to retain that or to rejuvenate that. If you have a passion, please continue to chase it, even when you feel like it's not being supported financially or even by audiences. I don't know how many people know how few things John Keats sold, a bunch of his poetry he sold when he was alive, or how few paintings Van Gogh sold when he was alive. People that we consider the masters of their arts. The work that you're doing may not be rewarded in a way that you can see immediately, but what you're doing does matter. Even if it's just to you right now, it does matter. So please keep doing it, because you never know when it's going to affect someone positively. I've already experienced that myself with what is a relatively small footprint for my movie that has had an impact on people that they have shared with me in ways that make me feel like if I did nothing else in my life, I've accomplished something. And I think that's true no matter what you're doing, whether you're, creating content online or you're writing a book or whatever it is, continue to pursue it. Don't let the lack of immediate recognition or profit or whatever make you lose the passion for continuing to do it, because even just the doing of it has value. One of the things that is also great about the horror community and the way that it connects to conversations about mental health, the history of people who have struggled with mental health have often been treated like the monsters by society itself. Tons of people who have had mental illnesses or physical disabilities or whatever have just been treated like the actual monsters in the way that horror movie monsters are treated. I think one of the reasons why so many people who would consider themselves out of the mainstream like horror, because they see themselves reflected in something that isn't exactly them, but is struggling with the same experiences that they struggle with. That's part and parcel for horror. And so it's easier to see yourself in something that isn't you. It's easier to see yourself in Frankenstein or a vampire or the survivors in a zombie movie. I think it's also helpful because, remember, we talked about the idea earlier of you being able to face anxieties about death and dying and losing loved ones in horror movies. I think the same thing is probably true of other issues that people deal with on a daily basis that aren't necessarily about death. Mental health issues, the idea of losing control, not being able to function in society the way that everybody else functions. Those are all the real life versions of what happens to us. There are bigger extrapolations of that in horror movies. It feels nice to be seen, even if the characters in the movie aren't necessarily the most quote unquote sympathetic. It's one of the reasons I think we love the genre, because you get to see a person in ways that aren't always sympathetic, but are empathetic. There's something powerful to me about the idea of witnessing someone that even in the other characters in the movie don't think is a good person, but you can find a way to connect with and empathize with. I think it was Roger Ebert that said that film is a machine for creating empathy. And I think horror is maybe the best place to do that, because it allows us to see a walk in life, to see a perspective, and to see it through someone else's eyes, to understand what scares them about it, what helps them survive through it, and in some way to understand something about others or about ourselves by witnessing it through them.